10:15, okay. All right. And so, you guys have studied Buddhism before, have you? You've done, have you guys, you've learned about it in class and all these kind of things, yeah? And this is your first visit to a temple? You guys do a couple a year or so? Yeah, just one? Okay. And then, so it's like a day where you go to all the different temples and synagogues and mosques. Okay, okay. And this part of a world religions course, is it? Okay, okay. Very good, very good. All right, and so what have you guys learned about Buddhism so far? Did you learn about the Buddha's life story or, yeah? Okay. And you learned a bit about the philosophy of Buddhism? All right. So does anybody have any questions? Is there anything that you'd like to hear about? You know, because I could talk for a bit, but it might cover material that you've already heard before. So is there any kind of points that were unclear in what you learned? Anything that you'd like to know a bit more about? Anybody? Yeah?
So the main goal for Buddhism, was it just to achieve nirvana? Is that what the main goal is, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's basically the only purpose of the Buddha's teachings. All the other things are kind of adjuncts to that. So it's kind of like, if you're going to university, your goal is to get a job. Like that's the whole point of going to university. But you go to university, all these things you learn in high school and all these other things, they all are a service to your life. But actually most of our education in the end is focused on being a citizen in a country, but it's also focused on, getting a job. So all these kind of various elements of our education come together to allow us to kind of survive and have a kind of job in society. And the same way, kind of the Buddha's teaching it, there's a lot of things that go into it. So you learn about like ethics, there's a strong ethical component, there's a strong charitable component, there's a strong component of mental development or practice, meditation. But all these have as their service, the end goal of it is to try to end suffering. So that's the whole point. There's actually after that, there's nothing else to do. So that's what the Buddha says. The people who've achieved that, there's nothing more for them to do, nothing to be added to what's been done. Because when we think about it, the whole point of everything we do is to try to find happiness. There's no point to our life really in Buddhist thinking besides that. Everything we do, any intention that we have, whatever we're looking for, all of it has as its end goal happiness. Yeah, so this is the Buddha's answer to that, is that there is a kind of permanent happiness that we can find, and that's the whole point of his teaching. Yeah. Yeah. Does anybody have any other questions?
You guys all see the statue of the Buddha with the flowers right there? What's that?
So that's an outdoor shrine there. And so basically, one of the ways that people kind of cultivate their minds in Buddhism is try to develop this kind of quality of respect. So I think when I went to a Catholic school. I used to live at a monastery near Perth, and a teacher there invited me to the Catholic school. And I was really impressed because I showed up and, he knew all the gestures, and then all the students seemed to know how to behave towards monks. And it's probably because I think in the Catholic religion, they have monks and priests. So there's this idea that, kind of common idea between maybe all religions with professional religious class, that you should have this attitude of respect, that there are things that are worthy of our respect, that are worthy of kind of holding higher than us. So oftentimes Asian Buddhists, the first thing they want to do when they come to a temple is to go and bow to the Buddha and these kind of things, And so there's often one outside because it's not always easy to get inside the temple. So they'll kind of go to the one outside, especially if it's a nice day, and that's the first thing that they'll do. And often Western Buddhists, there can be this kind of one of the things in modern Buddhism, as Buddhism has come to the West, there's this kind of, there's Buddhists who come to it, they call them convert Buddhists. In other words, they were from a different religious background before, and they converted to Buddhism. And the main reason they converted was through philosophy. They kind of studied it. They liked the philosophy, or people had emotional difficulties in their life and they wanted to find a solution. And so they came to it through that. And then there's another stream they call like a kind of ethnic Buddhism. It's kind of people who were basically born Buddhists. And so when Westerners see like a shrine, they have this kind of idea, like not necessarily people who have another religious background who understand about shrines and paying respects, but most Westerners, when they see a shrine, they're like, "What's going on?" There's a shrine. We've got flowers, we've got incense. People are bowing at the shrine. What's happening? They're bowing. And so it can come across when we see people doing these things, kind of bowing at a shrine, lighting incense, like they're kind of worshiping like a god, right? And especially if people come from a Christian background, as I know, actually my family has a Christian background as well, then there's this whole, there's an idea, especially from the Old Testament, about kind of worshiping images of God. You're not supposed to be able to make an actual image of him. And so that seems like really abhorrent, to some people who come from either this convert background where it's like, wait a minute, I came for the philosophy, or coming from a religious background that doesn't have idol worship. It's kind of, this is worshiping an idol. So those two kind of things, not to say with this, I don't know anybody's mind, but oftentimes just like culturally in the West, when people see an outdoor shrine, that comes up. And so in Buddhism, the Buddha was actually not a god. He's a historical figure. But Buddhists revere him almost, you could say, kind of more than the gods, because there's not in the sense of being a creator, but basically there's this idea in Buddhism that everything is subject to natural laws. There's these laws, you could say, that kind of govern the universe. And that's an idea that's also present in Western science. And so the Buddha found a way out of these laws. It's kind of being trapped in this cycle of cause and effect that leads people to suffer. And so Buddhists revere the Buddha. They have this reverence for the Buddha in the same way you'd have reverence for a great teacher. But he's also more than a teacher. And so all these things come together when we see a Buddhist paying respects at a Buddhist shrine. It doesn't mean that they're worshiping him as a creator, but in a sense they are kind of worshiping him. But not worshiping him in the sense that they're hoping for him to bless them, It's worshiping him in the sense of like the way you would worship somebody who's done something so great for you that you just can't express it any other way. So, yeah.
Are the flowers around it symbolic, or?
Yeah, so the flowers around it are basically, they're like, traditionally like monks can't handle money, can't really own many possessions. So there's only a few things you could give to them, So it's kind of, flowers you can give to the shrine, or incense, they'll use that to burn, and candles. Kind of use that, especially when it's dark at night. So probably the tradition partially stems from that. But I'm sure it does have a symbolic meaning. I can't remember what it is. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have a symbolic meaning in the text. This would be something that got added in later cultures. Yeah. Is any questions about that? About any of the things I just talked about? Yeah.
Well, we're actually a religion through the arts course.
Sorry?
We're a religion through the arts course.
Oh, okay.
We do the world religion course, but it's like an art class.
Oh, neat.
So part of what we studied too was a lot of the symbols and things that go along with Buddhism, but from an artistic perspective.
Oh, okay.
So is there any particular art or idea of art that is inherent to there's a lot of really nice things, but is there anything that's inherent to the philosophy or
Yeah, well, almost all the kind of art would have a kind of philosophical connection. Almost most of it, would have a philosophical connection. But, probably most of the great art in the world comes from religious motives. And so, so let's see here. So these here are devas. So often you'll see at a Sri Lankan temple, this is not necessarily the case at like a Thai temple, you'll see these people dressed like this. And these are kind of the equivalent of like angels. Yeah? So kind of angels in Buddhism, I guess you could call them angels. There's these kind of various levels of beings above our own. And the Buddha kind of, not all of them were Buddhists. They also have the ability to choose what religious philosophy they like. And so some of them got converted to Buddhism. And they become kind of protectors of the Buddhist religion. So then often at an entrance to a temple, you'll see in Sri Lanka, devas, these kind of, these beings dressed like this with very elaborate headdresses. They're said to be very beautiful, and they have this kind of radiance. They have their own light, and they have all these powers. And so they're protectors. So they're usually at the entrance to protect. And then, I'm not sure what these bigger ones are. There's also other classes of spirits that are called yakas. Bhante, that's Bhante Revata. And so these are kind of, this is another class of spirits, you know, that they're kind of an interesting class because actually right above the human realm, there's, you know, I guess you could say there's kind of heavens that are more or less associated with the world. The one right above us is more associated with our world. So it has kind of representations, it seems like, of physical features in our world. And there's kind of beings there that are kind of like people in our world. Like some of them are good and some of them get drunk and like get into fights, and they're kind of very rude. You know? And some of them don't like Buddhism at all. And so then there's a group of yakas. Some of them are protectors of Buddhism, some like it, and some really hate it. Because the Buddha teaches not to get drunk and not to, you know, party, so some of them are like really against that. And so these could be, I don't know, Bhante, are these yakas? Yeah. So these are yakas. So these would be some of the good yakas who are protectors of Buddhism, not the ones who don't like Buddhism. Yeah. And so then as far as other symbols in the back, this is of course a Buddha statue. Yeah, Puluwan. Oh, you want to take photo, Bhante? Yeah, okay, Bhante. So then the Buddha statue in the back. So actually, originally you guys might have studied this, must probably study this in art history. So this art history course then? Oh, okay, okay. So then originally there actually weren't any Buddha statues. So that's one of the very interesting things about Buddhism. And as a monk, you're kind of trying to figure, well, how did they do things with no Buddha image? Because most of our rituals involve bowing to a Buddha image. But not only was there no Buddha image, there was actually a hesitance to even create a Buddha image. It was seen as something like, you get the sense, it was seen as something kind of antithetical to what the Buddha taught, or something like he might not have liked. Because it wasn't until maybe 300 or 400 years later that the first Buddha images appeared. And interestingly enough, the first Buddha images were actually made by people from a kind of Indo-Greek civilization. It was actually kind of Greeks who made the first Buddha images. So these Greeks were kind of descendants of Alexander the Great, and they created a kind of, I think it was called Bactria. It's kind of maybe near Afghanistan, something like that. I don't know the actual. But they were the first ones to make Buddha images, and they were called Gandhara Buddha images. And so they look different than this Buddha. They tended to have a kind of much shorter robe. So the robes that monks wear now, they're actually probably 3 times the size that original Buddhist, maybe double, 2 or 3 times the size that the original Buddhist monks wore. And so the original Buddha images, they would have these short robes. And then the Buddha didn't have this kind of curly hair. His hair was loose, like an Indian person, and it was in a top knot. So it was usually tied together by a cord. And I don't know why that is, why they did that. You know? So actually the Buddha as a monk would have had a shaved head. He wouldn't have had any hair, but now always he's portrayed with this hair. And often the kind of stylization that happened, he didn't have these huge ears either. Sometimes he would have a dot between his head, I think. And other than that, the features might have been similar, although he would often be very buff. The Greeks would make him like with these huge muscles. So I remember I first saw this statue, an ancient Greek statue, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, is this like a modern statue that they kind of took and made like, the Buddha has these huge muscles, like his muscles are like this. I don't know why they made him like that, but I don't know, maybe Greeks and their warrior culture or something. Yeah?
Can you explain a bit more on the teachings of the Dharma wheel?
Dharma wheel, sure. So then what we have here, so I'll just finish off with some of the iconography of the Buddha image quickly and then go to that. So you'll see his ears. His ears are really long like this because that's a symbol of royalty. So you know, people in ancient India, if you were really rich, possibly you could have really heavy earrings. And so that might, you know, I don't know if people's ears actually got stretched or if that was a symbolic representation. Then this dot here, this is also common to Hinduism. And I was told in Hinduism it represents protection from the evil eye, you know. I don't know if it has that same symbolism in Buddhism, but it's generally a kind of mark of a spiritual person. And then this kind of a bump on his head. And I'm told that this actually represents kind of like an enlightened person, and kind of having this bump. So I think that symbolism changed, because if you see the original Greek images, it's actually just hair in a top, like wrapped, you know. And the way that people used to wear their hair had all these various meanings in ancient Indian culture. So people would have these different knots to denote their social status. So it could be that this kind of tying of the hair together meant that you were kind of like a religious person, kind of an enlightened person. So that's some of the iconography of the image. Now the Dharma wheel, so you want to know about the iconography of it, or do you want like the art of it, or do you want to know like its actual meaning, like what it means?
The meaning and the 8 teachings that are associated with it.
Okay, so basically when the Buddha first taught, that was called setting in motion the wheel of Dhamma. And so it's kind of, they had these, it's basically like a wheel, it's basically a symbol. It's kind of like this wheel that gets rolling and nobody can stop its rolling. It's actually the only, that's one of the first things he said or what the Deva said when he first started teaching, and the first person was able to realize some of his teachings was, okay, now the Buddha set in motion the wheel of Dhamma, and it can't be overturned or stopped by any being, by any god, by any Mara. Actually, the only way, the Buddha in his teaching said that the Dharma would eventually disappear, but the way it disappears is actually by people with bad conduct arising in the religion. So basically monks doing really bad things is what causes it to disappear, and it's inevitable that that will happen at some point. So that's often represented by this kind of like wheel. But in ancient India, they would have a lot of kind of representations of wheels. You know? So you often see these kind of very elaborately carved wheels, and often have spokes to them. So I think they often have 12 spokes. You know? And so one of the reasons for that is that actually there's there's 4 noble truths, and then there's I think there's kind of they have like 3 permutations of each truth. So in other words, you got a truth, a noble truth, and you have I can't remember. I'm not super good at the iconography, but I think it's like so you have a truth, and you have there's a duty to do for each truth. It's like that. There's like a duty. I can't remember the 3 things. I'd have to have to look them up. Maybe one of your teachers knows. Yeah.
Are you talking the center of the wheel?
No. I can't. They have 4 noble truths, and then there's duties for each of the truths, and they break them up into 3. So that's how we get 12 spokes on a wheel usually. And then the wheel in ancient India was also associated with. They had this concept that it was possible for one person to completely conquer the world. And so at various times in the world's history, it said that there were people who had successfully, completely conquered the world. You know, either in this they have this idea of universes evolving and disappearing, and there's times when somebody comes along and they totally conquer the world. It's everything they own. And they're called a wheel-turning emperor, this type of person. So this wheel is also associated with kind of a sovereignty. It's kind of being like a really great king. So it has all these representations. So when you hear a wheel in Buddhism, like a wheel isn't just like a dirty thing on a cart. It's also this, it's not, in the stories about these wheel-turning emperors, it almost sounds like this really powerful like weapon that they somehow have, and when people, it goes around, and when it goes to a place, then the people there accept the sovereignty of this emperor. So it has this connotation of sovereignty and also power, maybe not necessarily like an evil power, but also this kind of thing that's in motion. So it also has these religious images. So it all comes together as being this elevated thing, kind of a wheel, Dharma. Yeah. So any other questions? Those kind of things?
Yeah, I think
Mettā, yes. So mettā is basically goodwill. And so in the West, this is kind of often translated as like loving kindness. So it's actually a little different than loving kindness, because what it means is you have this kind of goodwill for everybody, but it's not love, So in Buddhism, there's a separation between what they call pema, which means love, like, the love we have for children or family members, or the love people have for like, their boyfriend or girlfriend. And this kind of love is seen as something like very fragile. In other words, it's actually in Buddhism, this kind of love, pema, is bound up with hate. The same mental fetter that makes us like fall in love with people, so that we love them so much and we can never, there's just like the one, and nothing ever bad, they can't do anything bad, and they're so bright. That same fetter is the same fetter that makes us hate people. And so it's interesting that, movies, a lot of the time, what we tend to see is this kind of linkage between violence and sensuality. So this is a single fetter called raga tanha. And this kind of pema in Buddhism is not really seen as like a very good thing, because often you see people, if they're in a relationship or whatever, there's somebody they really love, that person does something wrong, all of a sudden it can turn to this terrible hatred for that person. So actually divorce courts are the most dangerous court. They have all these, you talk to people who are in, who are in law, they say like the most security guards are at the family court. It's not like the criminal court where people are, where people have done these terrible things. It's at the family court. In other words, people have been so attached to each other, so in love with each other, and then one of them or the other, something happens, they split, and it turns into this gross hatred. So this is kind of pema. It has this aspect of making people attached to each other, attached to things, attached to various things, and love them. And it also has this aspect of making people hate each other. This mettā is a different concept. It's this concept that we wish well for people regardless, but it also has a certain detachment to it. It doesn't have the same level of like sinking your teeth in as pema does. It has this level of like goodwill, like you wish goodness for that person, but it's also like this thing where it's like a halfway meeting point almost. In other words, you have this goodwill spread out for the person, but you're not trying to go out and cling to them. In other words, even if a person does something really terrible to you, you still have goodwill for them. You don't like them because they're special to you. It's because you have this quality inside. And so that comes from a recognition that true goodwill means you wish that that person meets with good things irrespective. And that recognition also comes from another one, that true good things in people's lives arise when they do good deeds. So it doesn't mean that you wish that somebody who's doing evil gets better at that, and people who are cheating the stock market, they get even more successful cheating the stock market and get more money. But it comes from a recognition that if a person wants true happiness, they have to put the causes into place. So what we really wish for is that all beings learn to put the necessary causes into place to become truly happy. Comes from a recognition as well that all beings have their own choices, right? So we can't necessarily force people or situations to be the way we want all the time, you know? So that's why it's this kind of halfway meeting. So it's not the same as love. Like there's a sutta where it talks about having the love that a mother would have for her only child, you know? But it's not, it's sometimes argued that this is actually an expression like protecting the state of mind, the same way you would protect, a mother would protect her only child. Because obviously not everybody's going to want you to treat them like your child. I mean, even just go up to somebody on the street and try to treat them like they're your only child. They won't like that. You know? Kind of go up to somebody you don't know and give them a big hug, you know. So it's a very practical expression of kind of goodwill. It's kind of mettā. Yeah. Okay, so anybody have any other questions there? Yeah? All right, so we've got till 10:15, and so we could probably try, would you guys like to try a little bit of meditation as well? Okay, so what have you guys done meditation before? A little bit? Yeah? Okay, so maybe what I'll do is I'll describe a little bit about meditation. We can try some meditation. If there's any more questions at the end, then please feel free to ask, and then 10:15 should be coming pretty soon. It's amazing how fast these things go. You kind of answer a few questions and kind of the day is done. Yeah. So a little bit about meditation. So I don't want to talk anybody's ear off, and please feel free if you have any questions before you meditate to ask. But nowadays, meditation is actually really popular in the West. It's become increasingly popular. And it's also become very secularized, you know, which is not a bad thing necessarily. But there was actually a deliberate effort to strip it of its religious connotations by a person, what was his name? John Kabat-Zinn. And he first introduced meditation into, I think, Boston hospitals through this thing called mindfulness-based stress reduction. You know, so he had to strip it of all Buddhism for that to be palatable to the scientific community. And so nowadays what we tend to hear about with meditation is that what it basically is a method to reduce stress. You know? So in other words, everybody knows about stress. You know, people have kind of stress in their life. But this kind of idea that mindfulness is this tool to reduce stress is very prevalent. And so what we tend to have is meditation being fit in to our typical Western goals. You know? So it's worthwhile to know what these kind of things are, because actually this is a kind of odd fit. I mean, it can fit in certain ways, but there are certain things that we don't learn about when we think about meditation that way. You know? So typically, especially psychologically, if somebody goes to see a psychologist, goes to see a psychiatrist because they're having stress, the goal of that psychologist or psychiatrist is to get that person back to a normal state of mind so that they can go on living their life in society. You know? And oftentimes, the unspoken goal of Western society is that as long as we can have enough new enough new kind of sensory experiences, then we'll be happy. Actually, nobody spells this out, but if we study economics, this is the underlying theory behind economics, actually. It's called the theory of marginal utility, diminishing marginal returns. In other words, if you eat one burger, then that burger tastes good. If you eat a second burger, that burger tastes less good. If you eat a third burger, suddenly you're starting to get full. And if a guy's standing behind you like, eat burger number 4, you're totally disgusted with the burger. So the basis of our economic system is to switch, is to have something ready for us when that taste of the burger starts to go down. So we swap out a burger, instead of a burger, now we've got a movie. So in other words, it's this idea that as long as we can keep ourselves continually absorbed in sensual pleasures, then we'll be happy. And the goal behind, the unspoken goal behind psychology, because psychologists are not religious, they're not, psychology's fine, it does good things for people, but they can't be religious. They have to cater to people of all religions. So the unspoken goal behind psychology is to get us back to this state where we can just go eating more and more. But actually the problem is likely not with the fact that we can't get enough and that we're depressed or stressed. The problem is actually with the theory behind this, you know? In other words, going out to consume more burgers, to have the next fast car, the next big house, to have the next, all these things people need to get sometimes. You need to have a car, something if you're going to work. You need to have a house. You need to get your next big grade. But when this is all that we have as the purpose of our life, this is what causes us stress. Because these things are inherently unsatisfactory. And if you don't believe that, try to keep eating burgers. See, it causes its own problems, right? Try to keep going to movies. Eventually these things wear out and then people have to start doing drugs. That's where this obsession with drugs can come from. Actually, I know people who are addicted to drugs and they don't, this is the thing, it's this immediate hit of sensual pleasure. But they can't see any they can't even see any pleasure in things like going to movies or whatever. They can't go on trips because it's hard to travel anywhere if you can't get your drugs. Like even going to like Thailand or whatever, it seems boring to them because they can't smoke as much marijuana as they want in Thailand. And this is all a factor of endlessly searching to consume sensual pleasures. So if we take meditation and try to stick it onto this model, okay, I'm going to meditate to reduce my stress so I can get back to eating more burgers, it's not going to work. I think eventually they're actually going to run up into problems with this model that meditation is just to make our sensual pleasures much greater. People are going to start to question it because it won't work. It only works for a short time. So if we want lasting happiness, what meditation is actually for is to learn to counter the various negative mind states that we have. Actually, almost all religions know this. There's actually deep feelings of peace, contentment, happiness, even bliss in Christianity. They use the word ecstasy, that come from becoming a good person, from doing good deeds. Seems like something really simple, but it's like a garden. When we learn to cultivate it, it keeps growing. And when we first start watering it, it's like nothing is happening. You go to pick the fruits from the garden, you can eat them right away, but you're not growing anything then. This is the way a lot of people live their life, just trying to constantly pick fruits until one day their garden is dry. And they keep trying to pick it, there's nothing there. So when we come to meditation, it's to learn to grow. It's actually, the word for it is bhavana, which means development. In other words, it's about growing things. It's about cultivating these wholesome qualities, because this is where happiness actually comes from. Won't come from getting more and more houses, more and more cars. It comes from inside. Okay? So that's the theory behind meditation, something really important to understand. We won't do it just for the sake of getting less stress so we can go back to doing more things that'll make us more stressed. We do it to cultivate good, wholesome qualities in our mind. Those things are common to all religions. Okay? So the first type of meditation we'll do is called breath meditation. It's called the anapanasati, and it seems very simple. So basically you just learn to focus on your in and out breaths over and over again. There actually can be a lot more to it than that. But the thing about practicing this is when we learn to bring our mind back to an object over and over again, what we're actually doing is countering the usual tendency our mind has that causes us to suffer. Although we broke up with our boyfriend or girlfriend and we suffer, we don't want our mind to go thinking about that person, and we say, stop, don't think about them. Still it goes, right? Although we don't want to be constantly eating junk food and we get worried about physical appearance, we tell our mind, stop, don't go eating junk food, still it goes. Yeah? We don't want to, feel sad when something bad happens to us. We tell our mind, don't feel sad, still it goes out and rushes out. And the reason is because all the time in our lives, we train our mind to go rushing out to these things. So when we learn to come back to our breath over and over again, we're countering that tendency. Instead of our mind doing whatever it wants, we start to become the boss of our mind. Start to become more the owner of our mind. And it comes from simple things like this. Okay, so we'll do some breath meditation. And the goal of it is to just keep coming back to the breath and not letting the mind go anywhere else. Sounds simple. We'll see how it goes, okay? So the first thing we can do is get our body into position so we can lean forward a little bit, arch our back, and that helps to get our spine nice and lined up. And then I'll show you a little trick to do a little bit more spine lining up. And no worries if you're not used to sitting cross-legged on the floor, then it can take a bit. But here's a trick to get our spine lined up. Can take our hands and put them over our head like this, holding them parallel with our shoulders all the way up. And then turn them palms outwards, and keeping them parallel with our shoulders, bring them down, down, down past the ears, down past the shoulders, and into our lap. And that helps to get our spine lined up. And so with our spine lined up, we can look about 3 feet in front of us and close our eyes. Okay, and we can focus in on the breath. Can know when it's coming in and know when it's going out. If we breathe in a long breath, can just know I'm breathing in a long breath. And if we breathe in a short breath, can just know I'm breathing in a short breath. And we can focus in on the breath at the tip of the nose. And if we notice any patterns of tension or tightness around the nose or the face, can just let those relax. And when we're practicing breath meditation, can try to change our perception of the breath a bit so that it's not just air that we're pulling in and out of the lungs, but it's a kind of energy that's all around and coursing through one's body. And sometimes we can imagine the breath almost as if it's in front of us and we're watching it. But instead can change perception so that it's almost like one is totally immersed by the breath. Almost like one's right in the center of the breath. Kind of like standing under a waterfall. So on the in-breath, one can be totally immersed by the breath. On the out-breath, totally immersed by the breath. And when breathing in and out, on the in-breath, can just count 1 all the way through the in-breath. On the out-breath, can count 2 all the way through the out-breath. And can keep counting like this up to 10. And once we reach 10, can reverse the count and go back down to 0. And can try to make our awareness of the breath as continuous as possible. All the way from the time the breath enters the nose, on the in-breath, as it turns into the out-breath, and then as it exits on the out-breath and turns back into the in-breath. And if the mind wanders off to the past or the future, you can just bring it gently back to the present moment, to the breath. And before we finish meditating, it can be helpful to think back over the last 7 minutes or so. And just ask ourselves, what did we try out that seemed to work well? And what did we try out that didn't seem to work well? What made our minds more calm? Next time we sit down to meditate, can try to do what worked well again and see if we get the same result. And this is one of the ways that we can learn about cause and effect in our meditation practice and can learn how to develop it as a skill.